Hi, today I wanted to introduce our new NAS. It's the TS-i410X. This is a industrial wide temperature NAS. It's completely fanless, so there's no moving parts inside the device. You can tell by the chassis there, it's an all metal chassis with a heat sink design, so there's fins all around it to try and dissipate any heat that's created inside. At the heart of this product is a Intel Atom X6425E, which supports quite high temperatures on its own, and it supports 4 2.5-inch SATA SSDs. There's two 10 gig ports, even a HDMI output as well. Very rugged, and it withstands both high operating temperature windows, minus 40 Celsius up to 70 Celsius. And it's also really good for any environments where there would be vibration, like in a vehicle, for example, in an industrial setting. So we'll move straight on to some detail about the NAS. So here it supports 4 2.5-inch SATA SSDs. Ideally, you would use industrial grade SSDs to go with it. Most normal SSDs may have a max operating temperature of about 70 degrees Celsius, but you can get some from companies like Exascend that will support up to 85 degrees Celsius as well, which can help if you're installing this in a particularly hot environment. It's also got a wide input voltage, so we do have two inputs for power on this. You can use the supplied adapter that we give you, or you can use DC voltage. So if you're powering it from a vehicle, such as a bus, camper van, boat, something like that, you're able to power it directly off the 12 volt to 24 volt system that may be available there. It's got dual 10 gig ports. These are multi-gig ports, so they work at 10, 5, 2.5, 1 gig, and even 100 meg as well. So whatever switch you're connecting it to or devices, it will work with all of them. And there's two of those 10 gig ports. And with the vibration test, it's a military grade vibration test. The standard is MIL STD 810H. So we've got more information on that a bit later on. And there is a 4K compatible HDMI output on the back, so you could use that for displaying this live view from the surveillance. You could turn it into a PC with a virtual machine. There's lots of options you can use that HDMI for. So here's a typical application of it being installed in a vehicle. So these would be ideal for, say, a bus CCTV system if you wanted recording on the bus. Lots of different ways to connect it. As I mentioned, we've got the two power input options. You can see there we've got a green option for the DC power input, or we've got a barrel jack, the DC 12 volt, which comes from our own adapter. Just for reference, that's a screw-in connector, so you can probably tell by looking at the adapter there, there's a bit of knurling around the barrel jack. That screws on over the DC 12 volt connector, so it can't be shaken out or accidentally pulled out. It's fixed in there if you screw that up so that it's really in there tight. So yeah, depending on whether you've got 12 volt, 24 volt, so 24 volt would be available in larger vehicles like trucks and buses, things like that. We're able to take that. We've got a 9 to 36 volt range on the input there. So moving on to the anti-vibration testing. So this is a test that we've done so that if anybody does need to use it in any application where there would be a lot of vibration, the most common would be, say, in a vehicle application. We have had NAS before where people have put them in vehicles, so all SSD small NAS like the TBS unit that we do, but this one is definitely more suitable because this is completely sealed up. There are no fans, so that there's no dust and things that can get in there that get sucked in by a fan, for example. So the temperature range, as I mentioned earlier, is minus 40 Celsius to plus 70 Celsius. So that's the ambient temperature that it can operate in. So the components inside can get hotter than that. We've got a bit more on that later on as well. For example, the CPU can get up to 85 degrees Celsius, I believe. So you don't have to use it anywhere where there's air conditioning or a perfect environment. It will work in an absolutely massive range of temperatures there. If you are using industrial grade SSDs, you can change the default temperature setting for warnings in the NAS from 70 degrees Celsius up to the limit of the drive you're using. So you can get that from the spec sheet that you're using. So as I mentioned, as an example, XSN do make some industrial ones where their max operating limit for their drives is 85 degrees Celsius. So you can change the temperature alarm so that the alarm's not going off giving you errors at 70 degrees Celsius. It won't do that till they got up to 85 degrees Celsius. There is also an optional bracket for a VESA mount, so it's the 75 mils, so 7.5 centimeters between the holes. So if you wanted to physically mount this to something, you can use that as well. Everything's all screwed in place; it's not just clipped on. You screw the bracket to the base of the NAS, and the bracket slides into the wall-mounted plate, which then attaches with some bolts as well. So it's nice and rigid in whatever application that you're attaching this to. A little bit more about the CPU. So this CPU does also support down to -40 Celsius, but up to higher than the NAS itself, so 85. So the reason we've capped the NAS at about 70 degrees Celsius is there's got to be a difference in the ambient so that we can cool the device down. So while the CPU can get up to 85, it would have to be a really hot environment for it to get up there. When I get to the end of the slides here, I'll show you the NAS itself, and I'll go look at the temperatures on the NAS itself. But this is the Elkhart Lake series Intel Atom. Total power draw at max CPU usage is 12 watts there on the CPU itself. Obviously the NAS will be a bit more than that because it's got to power the drives and some other components, but it's a very low power usage CPU, but also quite powerful. It's a 4-core 4-thread 3 GHz CPU, and it supports AES-NI for the encryption as well, so you can do volume and folder encryption with that CPU as well. So here's a look at the back. So we've got highlighted here the two 10 gig Ethernet ports, and as I mentioned earlier, they will work at 10 gig, 5 gig, 2.5 gig, 1 gig, or even 100 meg. So you've got lots of different options you can use those for, and we've got the network and virtual switch in the NAS if you want to configure them in a certain way so that you can have two applications running on it, no problem at all. So here's the USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports. So for anybody unfamiliar, these are the 10 gig version of USB 3. So it's 10 gig a second from each of the 4 ports. So if you're connecting anything to those ports, such as external storage perhaps, or expansion chassis, things like that, you've got some nice fast ports to be able to do that with. Or you can just simply connect a keyboard, mouse, UPS, something like that into those ports, which don't need the high speed, but they will step down to the slower speeds if you need it. So here's the two options for the power. So we do supply the power brick with it, the power adapter there with the knurling on the connector that lets you screw it in. So it's a 12 volt adapter, completely standard. The idea is to keep the heat of the power supply out of the NAS so that it doesn't need to be cooled, because the adapter itself is passively cooled. But if we had the heat of the adapter inside the NAS, then we would have had to have put a fan. So this way, with it externally connected, we're able to keep that heat out so that the NAS is truly silent with no moving parts there. And as mentioned earlier, you can use DC power to power this device as well. So absolutely excellent if you're in an off-grid situation with, say, a camper van, bus, even a boat. You could use this as a Plex media server on a boat, for example. It would be a very excellent application for that, with some large enough SSDs to support the content you wanted to use. And also moving on to the HDMI port. So this does support 4K outputs. So you could, if you were using this for, say, surveillance on a bus, as an example I gave earlier, you could have the live view coming out of this HDMI port fed to a screen somewhere inside so that you could interact with it, go back, play recordings, things like that. You'd be able to do all that with that HDMI output so that you can see what you're doing. It does support 4 SATA SSDs, so to get to those, there's effectively 4 thumb screws on the front of the device. That removes the metal front panel that has a small gasket around the metal front panel, and the trays just slide out. They're not clipped in place, they're held in place with a sort of spring handle on the front when you screw the front plate on. So that's what keeps them inside the device itself. So the drive numbering there is 1, 2, 3, 4 from the top left to the bottom right. There is a sticker on the NAS that does let you know this as well. well. So this sort of blue sticker that you see on the side, the green area at the end does tell you what the drive ordering is, so you don't have to remember that from the slide here. Okay, so moving into some dimensions and all of the different I/O ports labeled up in one place. So on the front you can see the LED status lights for each of the SSDs, and around the back you've got all the different ports that we've already mentioned. So here's some specifications. I won't stay here too long, but if anybody wants to pause this to read all the specs, you can. The link to the product page will be at the description of the video. So if you want to read all the detailed specs, they are going to be linked in the bottom of the video there. Here's some performance information. So with the dual 10 gig ports, the read speed, we're able to fully max out those two 10 gig ports at over 2000 megabytes a second. And when you've got it unencrypted, we're able to do 1057 megabytes per second on writes into the NAS as well. If you do turn on the encryption, performance does go down a little bit, but it's still very respectable, especially for any application where you might need the industrial NAS. It's still able to get some pretty high performance figures, even with encryption enabled. For anyone interested, this is how you'd screw the drives into the trays. So they're not screwless chassis for the drives, so you do have to put 4 screws per SSD. It's mainly for the anti-vibration. They've got to be held in place physically, so we use these little bolts that we little screws that we supply in the box to attach it to the metal drive trays. So we've used metal trays just to transfer heat through to the chassis much more effectively than with plastic trays, for example. But there you can see the 4 thumb screws that you would use to attach the front plate to the NAS. Okay, so moving on into the user interface, there isn't a whole lot to show you here. Honestly, we've tried to make this look exactly like every other NAS we've got, so this wouldn't be a strange device to you. First of all, let's have a look at the specs of the device. So if we come in here and go to system status, we can see all the information. So there's the Intel Atom X6425E at 3 gigahertz, 4 core, 4 thread. It's got 8 gig of RAM. This is fixed, it's non upgradable, so it comes only in a variant with 8 gig of RAM, and that's built in as standard. So I've had it on here for about half an hour. If we go across to the hardware information tab, we can see all the temperatures. I will point out that we are in a bit of a heat wave warning in the UK, which isn't that high, but today is 26 degrees Celsius. I do not have air conditioning here, and these are the ambient temperatures from it operating. Touching the NAS, it feels pretty cool, so it's not hot to the touch at all, but yeah, only 39 degrees Celsius. I've only got the one drive in there, but the drive I am using is only at 31 degrees Celsius, so it's doing a really great job at keeping the heat down in the chassis. And obviously 26 degrees Celsius is very far short of the 70 degrees Celsius limit that we do support with this NAS. Because it's Intel architecture, we can install all the common power-hungry apps that you'd need. So here I've got a few installed. Container Station, if you wanted to run any containers for any reason. Virtualization Station, this would be absolutely fantastic if you wanted to run a virtual machine or anything in there. So it would fully support a Windows 11 VM, for example. As there's 8 gig of RAM in the device, if I go up here to the dashboard, we can see that with all these apps running, I'm only using 22% of the 8 gig of RAM. So there's absolutely plenty of RAM if I wanted to give, say, 4 gig of RAM off to a Windows 11 virtual machine to run inside this device. Absolutely no problem at all. We've got Hybrid Backup Sync 3, which would allow you to back up the NAS to any location that you needed, whether it's cloud-based or a directly attached device. And we've also got QVR Pro, which is our surveillance solution. It does also support QVR Elite, you just can't have both installed at the same time. But we do have QVR Pro, which gives you 8 free camera licenses with a 14-day playback limit, but you can remove that with a license fee if you need. But you've got 8 free channels to connect anything to. But as I say, unlimited recording, but a 14-day playback limit. So this is the TS-i410X, our new industrial wide temperature range fanless NAS. So if anybody has any applications for it, this is absolutely ideal for anything to do with vehicles or industrial settings, anything that requires the device to be in a very high temperature or a vibration susceptible environment, something like that. If anyone has any questions, please do ask them in the comment section down below, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks a lot. Bye.